Captain Una stood on the bridge of her massive warship, watching the broken human vessel float helplessly in the darkness of space. Her blue skin caught the light from the control panels, making her look like a living jewel. She was the leader of the Zephyrian Elite Guard, the most feared warrior group in the entire galaxy. These alien women were known throughout the stars for their incredible beauty and deadly fighting skills. "What do we have here?" Una asked, her voice flowing like music through the minds of her crew. The Zephyrians didn't need to speak out loud, like other species. They could send their thoughts directly into each other's minds, making them perfect team fighters. Lieutenant Mira, a tall alien with silver hair that moved like liquid metal, checked her scanning equipment. Her fingers danced over the controls without touching them, using her mind to operate the advanced technology. "It's a human ship, Captain. Looks like it's been through a terrible battle. The hull is torn apart and most of the systems are dead." Sergeant Aaron floated closer to the main screen, her body moving with the grace of a dancer. Like all Zephyrian warriors, she was breathtakingly beautiful, with features that seemed carved by the gods themselves. "Are there any survivors?" she asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really care about the answer. Mira's eyes glowed briefly as she sent her consciousness into the scanning systems. This was something humans could never do, actually becoming one with their technology. Just one life sign, a single human male. His name appears to be Jiho according to the ship's damaged records. The three alien women looked at each other and started laughing. The sound was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, beautiful but somehow mocking. Humans were considered one of the weakest species in the galaxy. They had no telepathic powers, no natural energy weapons, and their technology was seen as primitive and clunky. "Should we even bother rescuing him?" Aaron asked, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Humans are so ordinary. They can't even communicate properly without making those crude mouth sounds." Una considered this for a moment. The Zephyrians had rules about helping survivors, even if they were from lesser species. "We'll bring him aboard. It might be amusing to see what a real human looks like up close. I've heard they're quite disappointing in person." When they transported Jiho onto their ship, the three warriors gathered around him like scientists studying a strange insect. The human was exactly what they expected, completely unremarkable. He was average height, maybe 6 feet tall, with brown hair and dark eyes that had seen too much fighting. His military uniform was patched in several places, and old scars crossed his face and hands like a roadmap of past battles. But what really made the aliens laugh was his equipment. While Zephyrian warriors could create energy weapons with their thoughts and wore armor that responded to their emotions, Jiho carried actual physical objects. He had a backpack full of metal tools, some kind of projectile weapon, and what looked like primitive communication devices. "This is what the galaxy fears," Aaron whispered to her companions, her silver eyes sparkling with amusement. "Look at all that junk he's carrying. Does he actually need to touch things to make them work?" Mira covered her mouth to hide her giggles. "I heard humans have to eat actual food to survive. Can you imagine? Not being able to absorb energy directly from their surroundings like civilized beings." Throughout this entire conversation, Jiho said nothing. He sat quietly on the floor where they had placed him, methodically checking each piece of his equipment. His movements were precise and careful, like someone who had learned that his life depended on every detail being perfect. He didn't seem bothered by their comments or even aware that they were talking about him. The aliens found his silence even more amusing. "Maybe he doesn't understand our language," Una suggested. "I forget that primitive species need to learn communication instead of being born with it." "Or maybe he's just stupid," Aaron added with a cruel smile. "I've heard human intelligence is quite limited compared to ours." But Jiho wasn't stupid, and he understood every word they said. He had learned their language years ago, along with dozens of others. He was just focused on more important things like figuring out how to survive whatever was coming next. Because, in his experience, being rescued by aliens who thought humans were worthless never ended well. The peaceful moment on the Zephyrian warship was shattered when an emergency signal burst through their communication systems. The sound was harsh and desperate, cutting through the aliens' melodic mental conversations like a scream in a quiet library. Captain Yuna's expression changed instantly from amused superiority to deadly focus. Her crystalline blue skin seemed to glow brighter as her warrior instincts kicked in. "What is that signal?" she demanded, her telepathic voice sharp as a blade. Lieutenant Mira's hands moved quickly over her control panel, her mind diving into the ship's communication network. Her face went pale as she processed the information flooding through the emergency channel. "It's Research Station Omega, Captain. They're under attack by Kitharon raiders." The mention of Kitharons made all three alien warriors tense up immediately. These weren't ordinary pirates or rebels. Kitharons were nightmare creatures from the outer rim of the galaxy, standing nearly 8 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and an appetite for destruction that made them feared across 100 star systems. They didn't just rob or conquer. They destroyed everything they touched, leaving nothing but blood and broken metal behind. "How many ships?" Yuna asked, already moving toward the weapon storage area. "At least 6 Kitharon attack vessels," Mira reported, her voice tight with concern. "The station's defenses are failing fast. They have maybe an hour before complete destruction." Sergeant Arin was already suiting up in her combat armor, the advanced material flowing over her body like liquid silver. "We should call for backup." "Captain, 6 Kitharon ships is a lot, even for us." But Yuna was smiling now, a cold expression that made her beautiful features look dangerous. She glanced over at Jiho, who was still quietly sitting on the floor organizing his primitive equipment. An idea was forming in her mind, a cruel, amusing idea that would serve multiple purposes. "No backup," she announced to her squad. "This is perfect. We'll handle the Kitharons ourselves, and our human friend here will come along to watch." Her 2 companions looked at her in surprise. Bringing a weak, defenseless human into a battle against Kitharons seemed like asking for trouble. But then they saw the look in their captain's eyes and understood her plan. "Consider it educational," Yuna continued, her telepathic voice carrying a tone of mock kindness. "The poor creature has probably never seen real combat before. This will be a good learning experience for him." Mira started giggling, the sound echoing strangely in the metal corridors of the ship. "Should we give him a weapon, Captain? Maybe one of our basic training rifles, or will he throw rocks at the Kitharons? I doubt he could even figure out how to activate a proper energy weapon," Arin added, checking her own advanced plasma cannon. "Humans still use those primitive projectile devices, don't they? The ones that actually fire little metal pieces." Yuna nodded, enjoying the joke. "Let him watch how real warriors fight. Perhaps he'll learn something useful before we return him to his people. If nothing else, he'll have an interesting story to tell about how the Zephyrian elite guard saved an entire research station." The 3 aliens spent the next 30 minutes preparing for battle with the efficiency of true professionals. They checked their weapons, coordinated their telepathic links, and planned their assault strategy with the precision of a dance. Their entire approach relied on perfect mental communication and synchronized energy attacks that could cut through enemy ships like hot knives through butter. During the mission briefing, Jiho sat quietly in the corner, listening to every word, but saying nothing. The aliens discussed their battle plans as if he wasn't there, describing complex maneuvers that required split-second telepathic coordination and energy weapons that could adjust their power levels based on the user's thoughts. "The key is maintaining our mental link throughout the battle," Yuna explained to her squad. "Kitharons are savage, but they're not smart. They rely on brute force and overwhelming numbers. Our superior coordination will give us the advantage." "What about blast patterns?" Mira asked, adjusting her weapon settings. "Should we use wide dispersal or focused beams?" "Start with focused," Arin suggested. "Save the wide dispersal for when they try to swarm us." Throughout this entire technical discussion, they completely ignored Jiho. When they finally finished their planning, Yuna turned to him with an expression of false concern. "We should probably give you something to defend yourself with," she said, pulling out a basic plasma rifle from their weapons locker. "This is one of our training weapons. It's very simple. Even a human should be able to figure it out." But Jiho politely shook his head, his quiet voice barely audible over the ship's engines. "Thank you, but I have my own equipment." The 3 aliens looked at each other and burst into laughter again. What could this primitive human possibly have that would be useful against Kithaeron raiders? The moment their ship docked with Research Station Omega, the Zephyrian warriors knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The smell hit them first, a mixture of burning metal, spilled blood, and something else that made their sensitive alien noses wrinkle in disgust. It was the scent of pure destruction, the calling card of Kithaeron raiders. Emergency lights flickered red throughout the corridors, casting eerie shadows on walls that were scratched and torn by massive claws. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the terrifying sounds of battle, screaming voices, energy weapons firing, and the bone-chilling roars of the attackers. Captain Yuna moved forward with deadly grace, her energy weapon materializing in her hands like blue fire. Behind her, Lieutenant Mira and Sergeant Arin followed in perfect formation, their minds linked together in the telepathic harmony that made Zephyrian warriors so feared across the galaxy. Jiho walked quietly behind them, his primitive equipment, making soft clicking sounds as he moved. "Remember," Yuna's voice whispered directly into her squad's minds, "these creatures are savage but predictable. They charge straight ahead, relying on fear and overwhelming force. Our superior coordination will cut them down before they can reach us." The first group of Kithaerons came around the corner like a nightmare made real. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Their yellow eyes glowed with hunger, and their claws, each one as long as a human hand, dripped with fresh blood from their previous victims. When they saw the aliens, they let out roars that shook the entire corridor. But the Zephyrian warriors were ready. Moving as one mind in 3 bodies, they unleashed a coordinated barrage of energy blasts that lit up the hallway like lightning. The first wave of Kithaerons fell instantly, their massive bodies hitting the floor with thunderous crashes. "Perfect execution," Mira said aloud, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Just like training simulations. For the first few minutes, everything went exactly as planned." The aliens moved through the station like deadly dancers, their telepathic coordination allowing them to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Their energy weapons never seemed to run out of power, and their movements were so smooth they barely looked like they were fighting at all. But then something changed. The Kithaerons stopped charging straight at them like mindless beasts. Instead, they began using the station's damaged corridors and broken machinery to their advantage. Some hid behind twisted metal beams, while others used the station's multiple levels to attack from above and below. "This isn't right," Arin muttered, ducking as a Kithaeron dropped from a ceiling vent directly above her head. "They're not supposed to be this smart." Yuna's perfect formation began to break apart as the raiders forced them to fight in smaller, separated groups. The telepathic link that was their greatest strength started to strain under the pressure of constant combat. Mental fatigue was setting in, making their coordination sloppy and their reactions slower. "Maintaining formation," Yuna commanded through their mental link, but her voice sounded tired even in their minds. "Stay together. Don't let them separate us." But the Kithaerons seemed to understand exactly what they were doing. They used hit-and-run tactics, forcing the aliens to chase them through narrow passages where their coordinated attacks were less effective. Some raiders would retreat, drawing the warriors forward, while others would attack from behind. It was during one of these chaotic moments that they realized Jiho was gone. 1 second he had been following quietly behind them, and the next second there was just empty space where the human had been standing. Mira spun around, her silver hair whipping through the air as she searched the shadows. "Where's the human?" she called out, firing an energy blast at a Kithaeron that was trying to flank them. "He probably ran away the first chance he got," Arin replied, slashing at another attacker with her energy blade. "I told you humans were cowards." Even in the middle of the fight, Mira found time to laugh breathlessly. "The human ran away. Told you his kind were cowards. He probably found some hiding spot and is cowering in the dark." But Yuna wasn't so sure. Something about Jiho's disappearance felt wrong. The human hadn't seemed scared when the fighting started. If anything, he had looked more alert, more focused, like a predator that had just caught an interesting scent. As the battle continued to rage around them, none of the Zephyrian warriors noticed the subtle changes happening throughout the station. Broken security cameras were quietly being repaired. Damaged power systems were mysteriously coming back online, and somewhere in the shadows, something was studying the Kitharons with the patience of a hunter who had all the time in the world. 4. Hours into the battle, the beautiful Zephyrian warriors looked nothing like the confident fighters who had entered Research Station Omega. Their perfect hair was matted with sweat and alien blood. Their pristine armor was scratched and dented. Most importantly, their unshakable confidence was cracking like glass under pressure. Sergeant Arin was down, clutching her left leg where massive Kitharon claws had torn through her advanced armor, like it was made of paper. Dark blue blood seeped between her fingers as she tried to stop the bleeding. Her silver eyes, which had sparkled with laughter just hours earlier, now showed nothing but pain and fear. "The medical systems are offline," she gasped, her voice weak and shaky. I can't feel my toes anymore." Lieutenant Mira knelt beside her fallen comrade, her own energy weapons smoking from overuse. The advanced Zephyrian technology wasn't designed for extended combat like this. Their weapons were meant for quick, precise strikes against civilized enemies who followed the rules of war. But Kitharons didn't follow any rules except survival of the strongest. "We need to retreat," Mira said, her melodic voice cracking with exhaustion. "There are too many of them, Captain. Every corridor we clear, they fill with more raiders. It's like they're multiplying." Captain Yuna's perfect features showed strain for the first time since Jiho had met her. Lines of stress marked her crystalline blue skin, and her hands shook slightly as she gripped her energy weapon. The telepathic link that connected her squad, their greatest advantage in battle, was falling apart under the constant pressure of combat. "I can barely maintain the mental connection," Yuna admitted, something she would never have said in front of other aliens. "The chaos is interfering with our telepathy. I keep losing contact with both of you." This was the problem with Zephyrian fighting tactics. They were perfect warriors when everything went according to plan. Their telepathic coordination allowed them to move like one mind, controlling 3 bodies. But when plans fell apart, when battles became messy and unpredictable, their greatest strength became a weakness. The Kitharons, on the other hand, thrived in chaos. They didn't need coordination or fancy tactics. They were like a force of nature, violent, unpredictable, and absolutely relentless. Every fallen raider was quickly replaced by 2 more. Every cleared corridor was invaded again within minutes. "Maybe we should call for backup," Mira suggested, though they all knew help was hours away. The other fleets could... She never finished her sentence. A group of Kitharons burst through a maintenance hatch directly above them, dropping into their position like deadly rain. The aliens scattered, their broken formation making them easy targets for the raiders' slashing claws. That's when Jiho reappeared. He seemed to materialize out of the shadows like a ghost, moving through the battlefield, with a fluid grace that was completely different from the Zephyrian fighting style. Where the aliens moved like dancers, Jiho moved like smoke. There, one moment gone the next, always appearing exactly where he was needed most. But what caught the alien's attention wasn't how he moved, but how he communicated. Instead of telepathy or even spoken words, he used simple hand signals. A raised fist meant stop, fingers pointing meant direction. A slashing motion across his throat meant immediate danger. "What is he doing?" Mira whispered, watching as Jiho made a series of quick gestures to some station security personnel who had been hiding in a storage room. The humans responded instantly to his signals, moving with purpose for the first time since the battle began. They split into small groups, each taking different routes through the station. Some carried improvised weapons, others carried what looked like construction equipment. "Those are just hand signals," Arin muttered from her position on the floor. "Primitive communication. How could that possibly be effective?" But as they watched, something amazing began to happen. The scattered human survivors weren't running randomly anymore. They were moving with coordination that rivaled the aliens. Telepathic link. But they were doing it with nothing more than simple gestures and whispered words. Small groups of Kitharons that had been terrorizing the station suddenly found themselves surrounded. Raiders who thought they were hunting isolated prey discovered they had walked into carefully planned traps. The humans weren't fighting with advanced energy weapons or telepathic powers. They were using the station itself as a weapon. Ji-ho appeared beside the wounded Zephyrians, his quiet voice cutting through the battle noise. Medical bay is 3 levels down. Path is clear for the next 4 minutes. How do you know that? Yuna demanded, her training making her suspicious of any information she couldn't verify through her own telepathic network. Ji-ho pointed to a small device on his wrist, one of the primitive pieces of equipment the aliens had mocked earlier. Station security network. I've been watching the raiders' movement patterns for the past 2 hours. Mira stared at him in confusion. But the station's computers were destroyed in the first attack. The main computers, yes, Ji-ho replied calmly, but humans build backup. Systems for our backup systems. We learned a long time ago that technology fails when you need it most. As if to prove his point, the lights in their corridor suddenly came back on. Emergency barriers that had been stuck open for hours began closing, cutting off Kitharon reinforcements. Somewhere in the distance they could hear confused roars as the raiders found their usual routes blocked. "Follow his lead," Yuna ordered, reluctantly, watching as the humans' unconventional methods began turning the tide of smaller battles throughout the station. It went against every instinct she had as a Zephyrian warrior, but she was smart enough to recognize success when she saw it. For the first time since the battle began, the beautiful aliens started to wonder if they had seriously underestimated their quiet human companion. The reactor core of Research Station Omega was supposed to be the most secure location on the entire facility. Massive blast doors, reinforced. Walls and multiple security systems were designed to protect the station's power source from any possible threat. But as Captain Yuna looked around at their desperate situation, she realized that all those defenses meant nothing when the enemy was already inside. 30 terrified civilians huddled behind makeshift barricades made from overturned tables and broken equipment. These weren't soldiers or warriors. They were scientists, engineers, and researchers who had never expected to face anything more dangerous than a laboratory accident. Now they cowered in terror as the sounds of approaching death echoed through the corridors outside. Lieutenant Mira slumped against a control panel, her energy weapon completely drained of power. Her beautiful silver hair was now dark with sweat and grime, and her hands shook so badly she could barely hold her backup weapon. The elegant Zephyrian warrior, who had laughed at human primitiveness just hours earlier, now looked like she was ready to collapse. Sergeant Arin lay unconscious on the cold metal floor, her breathing shallow and rapid. The makeshift bandages around. Her leg was soaked through with dark blue blood, and her skin had taken on a pale, sickly color. Without proper medical treatment soon, she wouldn't survive the next hour. But their physical injuries weren't the worst part. Captain Yuna could feel her telepathic abilities failing completely. The mental link that had connected her squad for years was nothing but painful static now. The chaos and violence had overwhelmed their sensitive minds, leaving them as isolated and helpless as any ordinary species. 237 contacts, Yuna whispered, reading the last working scanner display. They're surrounding the entire reactor level. The number hit everyone like a physical blow. Over 200 Kitharon berserkers, all converging on their position. Even at full strength with working equipment and perfect coordination, the 3 Zephyrian warriors would have been outnumbered more than 70 to 1. The sounds outside were getting louder. Heavy footsteps thundered through the corridors as the raiders approached. Their bone-chilling roars echoed off the metal walls, promising violence and death to anyone they found. Some of the civilians started crying quietly, holding each other, as they waited for the end. "This is it," Yuna whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching chaos. "We cannot hold them, not against these numbers, not in our condition." She looked around at the civilians they had tried to protect, feeling the weight of failure crushing down on her shoulders. These innocent people were going to die because she had been too arrogant, too confident in her species' superiority. The beautiful, elegant Zephyrian fighting style that had worked so well in civilized battles was useless against the brutal reality of war. That's when Ji-ho stepped forward. The scarred human had been so quiet during their retreat to the reactor core that some of the civilians hadn't even noticed he was there. But now he moved with a calm confidence that seemed completely out of place in their desperate situation. His dark eyes showed no fear, no panic, just the focused intensity of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment. "You're right," he said in his quiet voice, looking directly at Captain Yuna. "You can't hold them. Your fighting style requires coordination, precision, and predictable enemies. But I can hold them." The aliens stared at him in disbelief. Mira actually laughed, though the sound came out as more of a sob. "You're just one human," she gasped. "What can you possibly do against 200 Kitharons?" Instead of answering with words, Jiho pressed a sequence of buttons on his wrist device. The simple-looking piece of equipment that the aliens had dismissed, as primitive technology suddenly began to change. Panels slid apart, revealing complex circuitry that glowed with soft blue light. Other pieces of his gear started responding to signals from the wrist device, unfolding and transforming in ways that seemed impossible. His patched military uniform began to shift and flow, revealing that it wasn't actually fabric at all. It was some kind of adaptive armor system that had been disguised to look like ordinary clothing. The material hardened into protective plates around his vital areas, while remaining flexible at the joints. Strange symbols appeared on the surface, pulsing with energy that made the air around him shimmer. The backpack he had been carrying opened like a flower, revealing compact weapons and equipment that put even Zephyrian technology to shame. What the aliens had thought were primitive tools were actually components of an incredibly advanced combat system, designed to look harmless until the moment they were needed. "What are you?" Yuna whispered, staring at the transformation taking place before her eyes. Jiho checked the energy levels on his newly revealed weapons, his movements precise and practiced. "I'm a human soldier," he replied simply, "and you're about to learn why the rest of the galaxy should be very grateful that we're on their side." The first Kitharon roars were now echoing from just outside the reactor core. The final battle was about to begin, but for the first time since entering the station, the beautiful aliens began to feel something they hadn't expected: hope. For two, moment Jiho's transformation completed, the very air in the reactor core seemed to change. The 30 terrified civilians stopped crying and stared in amazement as the quiet human they had barely noticed became something entirely different. His movements, which had been careful and measured before, now flowed with inhuman speed and precision. Captain Yuna watched in stunned silence as Jiho's enhanced reflexes kicked in. When the first Kitharon raider burst through the blast doors, the human moved so fast he seemed to teleport. 1 second he was standing beside the control panel, the next he was behind the 8-foot-tall beast, and the raider was already falling to the ground with a broken neck. "Impossible," Mira whispered, her silver eyes wide with shock. "No organic being can move that fast." But Jiho wasn't done. As more Kitharans poured through the entrance, he didn't meet them head-on like a traditional warrior would. Instead, he touched a series of control panels around the reactor core, his fingers dancing across interfaces that should have required hours of training to understand. The lights in the chamber dimmed, then began pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. The gravity generators, which had been running at normal settings, suddenly started fluctuating in specific patterns. Even the air circulation systems changed their flow, creating currents that pushed in seemingly random directions. "What is he doing?" one of the civilian scientists asked, clutching her research tablet like a security blanket. Jiho's voice remained perfectly calm as he continued working, even while dodging claws that could have torn him in half. "Humans don't have telepathy like your species," he explained, as if he was giving a lecture instead of fighting for their lives. "We can't read minds or coordinate through mental links, so we learn to do something different. We learn to make the environment itself fight for us." The first wave of Kitharon berserkers charged into the reactor core expecting easy prey. Instead, they found themselves stumbling as the gravity fields shifted beneath their feet. The pulsing lights confused their sensitive eyes, making it impossible to track their target accurately. The changed air currents carried scents in different directions, disrupting their natural hunting instincts. But that was just the beginning. As the raiders tried to adapt to these new conditions, the floor panels began opening in strategic locations. What emerged wasn't weapons or defensive systems. It was the station's own maintenance robots, but they had been reprogrammed with new instructions. These simple cleaning and repair machines, which normally moved slowly and carefully, now swarmed the Kitherons like angry metal insects. They weren't designed for combat, but Jiho had given them new purposes. Some released clouds of industrial lubricants that made the floor slippery. Others sprayed cleaning chemicals that burned the raiders' sensitive noses and eyes. He's turning the entire station into a weapon, Yuna realized, her voice filled with awe and terror. But how? When did he learn to control all these systems? The answer came as the second wave of attackers triggered traps that Jiho had apparently set up during his mysterious disappearance hours earlier. Corridor sections that the Kitherons had passed through safely before suddenly became death traps. Blast doors slammed shut at precisely the right moments, separating groups of raiders and making them easy targets for automated defense systems that had somehow come back online. Emergency fire suppression systems activated in specific areas, filling critical corridors with oxygen-displacing foam that left the Kitherons gasping for breath. Elevator shafts became vertical wind tunnels that knocked flying attackers out of the air. Even the station's waste disposal systems had been weaponized, creating suction traps that pulled unwary raiders into recycling chambers. "This is impossible," Mira gasped, watching as dozens of Kitherons fell to traps that shouldn't have existed. The station's main computer was destroyed in the first attack. How is he controlling all of this? Jiho paused in his work, just long, enough to show them his wrist device, which was now connected to dozens of hair-thin cables that ran throughout the reactor core. "Humans build redundancy into everything we create," he explained. "When the main computer failed, I activated the Me backup systems. When those failed, I switched to the emergency networks. When those failed, I used the maintenance protocols. The third wave of Kitherons found themselves fighting not just one human, but the entire station itself. Doors opened and closed to channel them into kill zones. Lighting systems strobed at frequencies that triggered seizures in their nervous systems. The artificial gravity rotated in impossible directions, sending raiders tumbling into walls at bone-crushing speeds. Some of the more intelligent Kitherons tried to retreat, but they discovered that Jiho had sealed off their escape routes hours. Gargo. The corridors they had used to enter the station were now flooded with superheated steam from the reactor's cooling systems. Alternative routes had been blocked by strategically collapsed ceiling panels. "We developed something better than telepathy," Jiho continued, his voice still unnaturally calm as chaos raged around him. "We learned to think like the universe itself. Every action has a reaction. Every system connects to every other system. Push here, and something moves over there." As the surviving civilians watched in amazement, what had started as a hopeless last stand became a systematic extermination. The Kitheron raiders, who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries with their brutal efficiency, found themselves completely outmatched by a single human who had turned their greatest strength, their overwhelming numbers, into a weakness. Reactor Core, which had seemed like a trap just minutes earlier, had become the center of the most sophisticated defensive network any of them had ever witnessed. And at the heart of it all stood Jiho, no longer the quiet, primitive human they had rescued, but something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The battle had been raging for 20 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone watching. Wave after wave of Kitheron berserkers had thrown themselves against Jiho's defenses, and wave after wave had been systematically destroyed. The reactor core, which should have been painted with human blood by now, remained completely secure. Not a single civilian had been harmed. Not one of the wounded Zephyrian warriors had been touched. Jiho stood in the center of the chaos like the eye of a hurricane, his enhanced systems allowing him to coordinate dozens of defensive measures while carrying on a conversation as if he was discussing the weather. His voice remained calm and steady, even as another group of 8-foot-tall monsters charged toward him with claws extended. "You're not warriors," he said to the 3 alien women, gesturing casually toward a control panel that immediately released a cloud of blinding gas. The charging Kitherons stumbled into each other, their attack formation collapsing into confusion. "You're athletes. You've turned war into a sport with rules and elegance." Captain Yuna wanted to argue with him, to defend the honor of her people, but she couldn't find the words. Everything she had believed about combat, everything she had been taught about superiority in battle, was crumbling as she watched this single human accomplish what her entire elite squad couldn't do. The Zephyrian way of fighting was indeed beautiful. Their energy weapons created patterns of light that looked like deadly artwork. Their telepathic coordination allowed them to move together like dancers performing a perfectly choreographed routine. Even their armor was designed to look as impressive as it was functional, with flowing lines and crystalline details that caught the light. But Jiho's methods were the exact opposite of beautiful. They were crude, practical, and utterly ruthless. When Kitharans tried to climb the walls to reach him, he activated magnetic fields that slammed them into metal support beams with bone-crushing force. When they tried to overwhelm him with numbers, he opened floor panels that dropped them into industrial machinery. Nothing he did was elegant, but everything he did worked. "Humans learned war from necessity," Jiho continued, his hands never stopping their work on the control systems. Another wave of berserkers had just entered the reactor core, but they immediately found themselves struggling against artificial gravity that pulled them in 3 different directions at once. "We fought for survival against creatures, elements, and each other for millions of years. We didn't make it beautiful. We made it effective." As he spoke, the terrible truth of his words became clear to everyone in the room. The Zephyrians had evolved as the dominant species on their peaceful homeworld. Their telepathic abilities and energy weapons had made them nearly invincible against any threat they encountered. War for them was something that happened to other lesser species, but humans had evolved differently. They had spent countless generations fighting everything: predatory animals, natural disasters, diseases, and each other. They had been forced to develop not just weapons and tactics, but an entire way of thinking that treated survival as the only rule that mattered. "Your telepathy makes you predictable," Jiho said, manipulating the station's heating systems to create superheated air currents that forced the Kitharans into carefully prepared kill zones. "You coordinate perfectly, but you can't adapt when your enemy refuses to follow your patterns. Humans learned to fight unpredictably because we had to." The reactor room's walls were indeed painted with Kitharon blood now, dark stains that marked where dozens of the massive raiders had fallen to traps they never saw coming. But despite the carnage surrounding them, Jiho's protection of the civilians and wounded aliens was absolute. He had created an invisible barrier of death around them that no enemy could cross. Lieutenant Mira stared at him with completely new eyes, her beautiful face showing a mixture of awe and fear. What are you?" she whispered. Jiho paused, in his work just long enough to look at her directly. For the first time since his transformation began, she could see something almost human in his expression. Not the cold calculation of a living weapon, but the tired smile of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a long time. "I'm exactly what I told you I was," he replied simply. "I'm a human soldier. The difference is that now you understand what that actually means." He turned back to his controls as another group of Kitharans tried to break through his defenses. "Every human child learns that the universe is trying to kill them from the moment they're born. We learn to fight gravity, weather, disease, aging, and each other. By the time we reach adulthood, we've spent our entire lives studying how to turn anything and everything into a weapon." The truth hit the Zephyrian warriors like a physical blow. They had thought humans were primitive because they lacked telepathy and energy weapons, but they had completely missed the point. Humans didn't need those things because they had learned to weaponize reality itself. "This is why the galaxy should be grateful we're on their side," Jiho said, as the last of the current wave of attackers fell to his traps. "Because if we weren't, there wouldn't be a galaxy left to worry about." The silence that followed the last Kitharon's death was almost deafening. After hours of roars, screams, and the sounds of battle, the sudden quiet felt unnatural and strange. 30 civilians huddled together in the reactor core, their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something impossible. They had watched one human do what an entire military fleet would have struggled to accomplish. The rescue ships arrived exactly 43 minutes later, their sensors detecting the end of all hostile activity on Research Station Omega. Captain E. Darius of the Galactic Defense Force led the boarding party, expecting to find nothing but bodies and destruction. What he found instead would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. The outer levels of the station were indeed scenes of total devastation. Corridors were torn apart by Kytheron claws. Blast doors had been ripped from their hinges. Emergency. Lighting flickered over pools of dark blood and scattered equipment. It looked like a war zone where hundreds of beings had fought and died. But as the rescue teams made their way deeper into the station, following the trail of destruction toward the reactor core, they began to notice something strange. All the blood was Kytheron blood. All the bodies belonged to the raiders. There were no human casualties, no dead civilians, no fallen Zephyrian warriors. "This doesn't make sense," Captain Darius muttered into his communicator. Sensors showed over 200 Kytheron signatures entering this station. Where are the defenders? Who could have killed this many raiders? The answer waited for them in the reactor core, where they found a scene that seemed to belong in a different universe. From the carnage outside, 30 research scientists sat quietly in groups, some crying with relief, others staring blankly at nothing. 3 Zephyrian warriors lay on makeshift medical beds, wounded but alive and receiving treatment from human medical personnel who had emerged from hiding, and in the center of it all stood Jiho. He looked exactly like he had when the Zephyrians first rescued him, a tired, scarred human soldier in patched military gear. His primitive equipment was neatly organized in his backpack. His simple weapons were holstered and cleaned. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested he had just single-handedly destroyed an entire Kytheron raiding force, except for the blood on his hands and clothes, and the way every person in that room, alien and human alike, looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "What happened here?" Captain Darius demanded, his trained military mind struggling to process the scene before him. Captain Yuna tried to answer, but her voice caught in her throat. How could she explain what she had witnessed? How could she describe the transformation of a quiet human into something that had made the laws of physics bend to his will? "Kytheron raiders attacked the station," Jiho said simply, his voice back to its previous quiet tone. "We defended it. The civilians are safe, the raiders are dead, mission accomplished." But Darius wasn't satisfied with such a simple answer. Sensors showed over 200 hostiles. "Where's your backup? Which fleet responded to the distress call?" "No backup," Jiho replied, shouldering his pack with the same careful movements he had used before his transformation. "Just us." As the rescue teams began evacuating the wounded and taking statements from survivors, Jiho's enhanced combat systems had completely powered down. The adaptive armor that had deflected Kytheron claws now looked like ordinary fabric. The weapons that had controlled an entire space station were just simple tools again. Even his enhanced reflexes and strength had returned to normal human levels. Lieutenant Mira watched this transformation in reverse with fascination and growing fear. "The enhancement you witnessed," Jiho explained quietly when he noticed her, "staring is temporary. It only activates under extreme stress when human lives are threatened. Most of the time we appear exactly as we are, unremarkable, limited, weak." The implications of his words hit the aliens like a physical blow. If this quiet, unassuming human could become something so dangerous when pressed, what about the billions of other humans scattered throughout the galaxy? How many of them carried similar hidden capabilities? Captain Yuna approached him slowly, her movements careful and respectful in a way that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why hide such incredible capabilities? Why let other species think you're primitive and weak?" Jiho paused in his packing, considering her question with the serious attention it deserved. When he looked up at her, his dark eyes held depths of knowledge and experience that she was only beginning to understand. "Because," he said, his scarred face showing the faintest hint of a smile, "would you rather face an enemy you understand, or one you constantly underestimate?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone who heard it to reconsider everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. As Jiho walked toward the evacuation ships, the beautiful Zephyrian warriors realized. They had learned the most important lesson of their lives: never judge a species by its appearance. The most dangerous predators often looked the most harmless. Captain Yuna sat in her private quarters for 3 days after the incident at Research Station Omega, staring at a blank report form on her computer screen. How could she possibly explain what had happened in words that other beings would believe? How could she describe the transformation of everything she thought she knew about the universe? Finally, she began typing. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster as the words poured out of her. She wrote about the Kitharon attack, about her squad's failure to handle the situation, and about the quiet human who had saved them all. But most importantly, she wrote about the dangerous mistake the galaxy had been making for centuries. Immediate reclassification required, she typed in bold letters at the top of her report. Humanity must be upgraded from primitive species. Status to strategic allies effective immediately. Previous assessments were not just wrong, they were catastrophically dangerous. She described Jiho's hidden capabilities in careful detail, making sure to emphasize that his abilities weren't unique or special. According to him, every human carried similar potential, activated only when absolutely necessary. The galaxy wasn't dealing with one exceptionally gifted individual. They were dealing with an entire species of hidden weapons. We must reconsider our assumptions about this species, she wrote in her conclusion. Their apparent limitations are deceptive. They possess adaptive capabilities and tactical thinking that far exceed our own. Most critically, they have spent their entire evolutionary history learning to hide their true nature until the moment of crisis. The report hit the Galactic Council like a nuclear bomb. Within hours, copies were being transmitted to every major civilization in known space. Emergency sessions were called. Defense ministers demanded explanations. Scientists began frantically reviewing every interaction their species had ever had with humans. The Andorian Empire, which had been planning to expand into human territory, immediately cancelled their invasion fleets. The Crystalline Collective, which had considered humans too primitive for trade agreements, suddenly found themselves very interested in establishing diplomatic relations. Even the ancient Eternals, who rarely paid attention to younger species, began monitoring human activities with new interest. But perhaps the most significant change happened among species that had already been working with humans. Suddenly, every human diplomat, trader, and explorer in the galaxy found themselves being treated with a level of respect and caution that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. On Zephyrian Prime, the warrior academies began teaching new courses about adaptive combat theory and hidden capability assessment. Young Zephyrian cadets were told the story of Research Station Omega as a warning about the dangers of underestimating any species, no matter how primitive they appeared. Months later, when Jiho's ship was finally repaired and ready for departure, the 3 Zephyrian warriors came to see him off at the spaceport. The contrast between this farewell and their first meeting was striking. Gone was their earlier mockery and dismissive laughter. Instead, they approached him with the careful respect usually reserved for visiting royalty or dangerous predators. Lieutenant Mira, who had once giggled about his primitive equipment, now studied his every movement as if trying to memorize important lessons. Sergeant Arin, fully recovered from her injuries, stood at perfect military attention when addressing him. Even their body language had changed. They kept respectful distances and never turned their backs on him. "Will we see you again?" Mira asked, her voice carrying genuine hope mixed with uncertainty. For the first time since they had met him, Jiho smiled. It was a warm, human expression that somehow made him seem both more approachable and more dangerous at the same time. "Probably not," he replied honestly. "My job takes me to places where things have gone very wrong. I hope you never need someone like me again." He shouldered his pack, the same primitive equipment that had once been a source of alien amusement. "But you'll see others like me. We're everywhere now, watching, learning, adapting. Some of us are teachers, some are merchants, some are explorers. Most of the time we really are just ordinary people, trying to make our way in the galaxy." Captain Yuna stepped forward, her crystalline blue skin reflecting the spaceport's lights. "And the rest of the time?" Jiho's smile faded slightly, replaced by the serious expression they had come to associate with his more dangerous moments. The rest of the time we're exactly what you saw at the station. The galaxy is safer with humans in it because we've learned that the best way to keep peace is to be prepared for war. As his ship lifted off and disappeared into the star-filled sky, the three Zephyrian warriors stood in contemplative silence. They had learned the most important lesson of their military careers. In a universe full of unknown dangers, it was better to have humans as friends than enemies. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. And perhaps, Una thought, as she watched the ship's lights fade into the distance, that was exactly what humans had been planning all along.